Hey, have you ever thought that you were in a paradise and quickly realized you were in a wilderness? Or thought that you were about to live out the calm, cool life of tending a garden and quickly you found yourself wandering through a desert? See, I think sometimes we can make language so poetic and so flowery that we disguise the deep pain that life can bring sometimes. See, I'm convinced we all have a voice, but I also wonder how many times we have run from the desert when the desert exactly is the place where God wants to meet us. My opening word was breathe. Because if you're going to have a voice, you have to breathe. Because before you ever say a word, you have to inhale. You have to have something inside of you that literally propels what is inside of you out into the world. That's the beauty of the creative process. That to create, you have to have something to say. You have to have a voice. And to allow your voice to be heard, you have to breathe and have life in you. Wouldn't it be an incredible world if we only created out of life? That we never again tried to create out of death, out of violence, out of anger, out of bitterness, out of despair, but that we created as an act of hope. Because in the end, the creative process is always an act of hope that believes that something can come into existence that does not yet exist. But I find that we all want to have a voice and be a voice, but we really don't want to experience the wilderness or the desert. But when John the Baptist walked before Jesus was recognized, he was known as a voice in the wilderness. He came out of the wilderness declaring a message of hope and life and freedom. And the reason that this particular designation was given to John is that he was almost a shadow of an earlier prophet named Elijah. And in fact, they asked, "Are you Elijah?" Which is an odd question to ask generations after Elijah lived. But the people of Israel expected that Elijah would return. And he would be a promise of the Messiah to come. And it was Elijah who was that original voice in the wilderness. Hey, have you ever thought that you were in a paradise and quickly realized you were in a wilderness? Or thought that you were about to live out the calm, cool life of tending a garden and quickly you found yourself wandering through a desert? See, I think sometimes we can make language so poetic and so flowery that we disguise the deep pain that life can bring sometimes. See, I'm convinced we all have a voice, but I also wonder how many times we have run from the desert when the desert exactly is the place where God wants to meet us. In 1 Kings chapter 19, we have a moment in the life of Elijah. It says, "Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, 'May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them.' Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there and he came to a broom bush and sat down under it and prayed that he might die. 'I have had enough, Lord,' he said. 'Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors.'" This is one of the most peculiar transitions that I've ever seen in someone's life. Is that if you don't know the immediate backstory, what happened just before that is Elijah by himself goes to war against hundreds of prophets of false gods, worshipers of Baal and Balak. And they set up 2 altars and they cry out to their gods to see if their gods could bring fire from heaven to set the altar on fire. And then Elijah was to cry out to his God and ask him to set the altar on fire. And of course, Elijah let them go first. And as they prayed and prayed and prayed, and they actually began to cut themselves as an act of sacrifice to motivate their gods to act. But of course, their gods could not act because they were not gods, so they could not act. And then it was Elijah's turn. And after Elijah simply laid out one prayer so that everyone could hear it, it tells us that fire came down from heaven and consumed the altar that beforehand Elijah had drenched in water just to make it a little more difficult. Now, how can a man with that level of confidence in God suddenly find himself here? So right after that, Jezebel sends a message to Elijah, I'm going to kill you by tomorrow. Now, you would think this particular individual who stood in front of hundreds of false prophets, prayed to heaven, and saw fire come down would just laugh that off. Who is this woman? Jezebel. Who does she think she is? I mean, really, does anyone have a child named Jezebel? I mean, no one named their daughter Jezebel. You may have a Dalmatian or a dog named Jezebel, but you do not have a daughter named Jezebel. Jezebel never became popular because of who she was. The wife of Ahab, but she personifies evil. She personifies darkness and hatred and violence. And instead of standing the way he stood just before, he runs for his life. And I think this is a part of the irrational nature of the human spirit. See, what will happen in your life and in my life when we have the opportunity to become a voice in the wilderness is that fear will steal your voice. See, in this moment, it wasn't a rational fear that stole Elijah's voice. It was an irrational fear. He should have been afraid in front of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of prophets, but he wasn't. He had absolute confidence in who God was. But when he hears this message, this threat that she's going to kill him, he runs for his life, and then he goes and hides in the wilderness, and then he basically gives up and says, take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Isn't it odd that Elijah actually surrenders his life to a threat from one person when just before he had the courage to stand in front of hundreds? See, what I find in our life is many times we are most vulnerable after our greatest accomplishments. We are most vulnerable after our greatest victories. Many times in life what happens is when we have these epic, extraordinary mountaintop moments in life and we feel indomitable, we feel as if we are impossible to conquer, we feel as if we have a strength that is the strength of hundreds. Suddenly then after that, something comes our way and we have an irrational fear because inside of us, we know that we're not the ones who brought fire from heaven. We know who we are. And we're afraid that someone else knows who we are. And so we run. See, so oftentimes in our lives, when we're running for our lives, we're actually running from our life. Elijah was running from the challenges that God had placed before him. We have a world filled with conflict. We live in a time where it would be so easy to shrink back and ignore all the crises that we face. We have a society that's in a critical moment where white and black are at war, where those who are supposed to be defending us are the ones that we're beginning to fear the most. We're in a moment where we're going to create blanket statements over people, and so we can't see that there are good police officers and then those who are not so good. We can't see that right and wrong and good and evil is not about color or race or occupation. We're at a point in our history where we're terrified of terrorism. And so we find ourselves shrinking back because we're so afraid to do anything that might cause us harm. But the reality is that as long as you live in fear, you will never find your voice. But I can tell you that one of the great dangers in life is to live your life in fear what other people think of you. To live your life in fear of the rejection of others. To live your life in fear that you will not live up to the standards of others. See, I discovered years ago that this phrase, the fear of the Lord, which is a troubling phrase, because if God is love, why should we fear him? And years ago, I began to realize that we all have to grapple with fear. And whatever we fear, that becomes our master. Whatever we fear, that's what has control over our lives. And everything else that you fear is a cruel master. See, when you fear God, God is love, and perfect love casts out all fear. So when all your fear is directed toward God, you are now free from fear, and you are free in love. And Elijah forgot this. He forgot that his courage and his strength came when he had the confidence that God was with him. And so when Jezebel says, I'm going to kill you tomorrow, he starts running for his life. And here's the ironic thing. It's not that he actually was convinced that Jezebel was more powerful than him. He somehow became convinced that Jezebel was more powerful than God. Because Jezebel would have to get through God to get to him. I love how desperate he is. You ever get around friends that are so extreme? Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. He came to a broom bush and sat under it and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord. My life has been so hard. I just can't take it anymore. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. It would have been so easy if God goes, what about yesterday? See, I find this all the time. People who one day go, I just have so much faith in God. The next day, I just don't know where God is. My life is awesome, and my life is over. I mean, it's amazing. One's called Tuesday, the other one's called Wednesday. I mean, what is wrong with us? See, I think the difference is that when you're leaning into the life God created you for, you begin to live a life of incredible courage. But when you begin to run from it, fear begins to consume your soul. And fear will steal your voice.
At TBN, our mission is to use every available means to reach as many individuals and families as possible with the life-changing gospel of Jesus Christ.
Thank you for helping make the gospel of grace go around the world.
Without you, we couldn't do it. God bless you.